Have you ever wondered if the terrifying infection from The Last of Us could actually happen in real life? I mean, we're talking about a fungus that completely takes over human brains, turns people into mindless killers, and spreads faster than wildfire through entire civilizations. Sounds like pure science fiction, right? Well, what if I told you that nature already has something eerily similar, and scientists have been studying it for decades? The world of The Last of Us presents us with one of the most chilling apocalyptic scenarios ever imagined. A parasitic fungus called Cordyceps transforms humans into zombie-like creatures, effectively ending civilization as we know it. But here's where things get really interesting, and honestly, a bit terrifying. This isn't just some writer's wild imagination running amok. The creators of The Last of Us base their fictional infection on a very real fungus that already exists in nature, doing exactly what you see in the game, just not to humans. Yet, my name is your host, and I've spent countless hours researching mycology, parasitology, and infectious disease patterns to bring you the most comprehensive breakdown of how realistic this nightmare scenario actually is. What I discovered will probably keep you awake tonight, because the line between fiction and scientific possibility is thinner than you might think. In this deep dive, I'm going to walk you through the real science behind Cordyceps fungi, examine how the infection mechanics work in The Last of Us, and reveal whether humanity could actually face this kind of biological catastrophe. We'll explore the terrifying ways these fungi already manipulate their hosts in nature, investigate the specific conditions that would need to exist for a jump to human infection, and analyze the most disturbing parallels between the game's infection stages and documented fungal behaviors in the wild. But first, let me show you something that will completely change how you think about this topic. There are documented cases of fungi that can already influence human behavior, and some researchers believe we're just one evolutionary leap away from something far more sinister. The story begins with a simple question that haunted the creators of The Last of Us. What if the most sophisticated biological computer on Earth, the human brain, could be hijacked by something as simple as a fungus? This question led them to discover Cordyceps unilateralis, a real parasitic fungus that has been perfecting the art of mind control for millions of years. Picture this scenario. You're an ant going about your daily business when suddenly something changes. Your behavior becomes erratic. You abandon your colony, your family, everything that matters to you. You climb higher and higher into the forest canopy, driven by an irresistible urge you can't understand or control. Then, at the perfect height and humidity level, you clamp your jaws onto a leaf and wait. That's the last conscious decision you'll ever make. What happens next is straight out of a horror movie. The fungus that infected you begins to consume your body from the inside out, using your nutrients to grow and spread. Eventually, a fruiting body erupts from your head, releasing thousands of spores that rain down on your unsuspecting colony mates below. You've become patient zero in a biological weapon system that's been refined over millions of years of evolution. This isn't science fiction. This is happening right now in forests around the world to countless insects every single day. The Cordyceps fungus family has mastered the art of behavioral manipulation to such a degree that different species have evolved to target specific hosts with surgical precision. Some target ants, others go after beetles, spiders, or moths. Each has developed unique biochemical keys to unlock and reprogram their chosen victims' neural pathways. The most unsettling part? Scientists still don't fully understand how these fungi manage to take control of their host's behavior. We know it happens, we can observe the results, but the exact mechanisms remain largely mysterious. Some researchers believe the fungi release psychoactive compounds that alter brain chemistry. Others think they might physically invade neural tissue and manipulate it directly. The truth is probably more complex and terrifying than either explanation alone. Now here's where The Last of Us takes this real-world nightmare and asks the ultimate what-if question. What if a Cordyceps strain evolved to target humans? What if our complex brains, with all their sophisticated neural networks, became just another biological computer for a fungus to hack and reprogram? In the game's universe, this theoretical strain doesn't just randomly appear. It emerges through a perfect storm of environmental factors, human interference, and evolutionary pressure. The fictional Cordyceps brain infection, or CBI, represents what scientists call a host jump, where a parasite successfully adapts to infect a completely new species. These events are rare, but they do happen in nature, and when they do, the results can be catastrophic. Think about it from the fungus's perspective. For millions of years, Cordyceps has been stuck infecting relatively simple insects with predictable behaviors and limited mobility. Suddenly, it gains access to the most intelligent, mobile, and socially connected species on the planet. Humans don't just wander around forest floors like ants. We fly across continents, live in massive population centers, and have complex social structures that could accelerate transmission beyond anything the fungus has ever experienced. The game presents this infection as progressing through distinct stages, each more horrifying than the last. It starts with what appears to be a normal respiratory illness. Victims develop a cough, fever, and fatigue. Nothing too alarming at first glance. But within hours, the behavioral changes begin. Increased aggression, loss of higher cognitive function, and an overwhelming compulsion to spread the infection to others. What makes this progression so believable from a scientific standpoint is how closely it mirrors what we observe in real Cordyceps infections. The fungus doesn't just randomly destroy its host. It carefully preserves the motor functions and basic drives necessary for transmission, while systematically shutting down higher-order thinking and self-preservation instincts. Stage 1, infected humans in The Last of Us, called runners, retain most of their physical capabilities but lose rational thought and become violently aggressive toward uninfected individuals. This behavioral modification serves the fungus perfectly. The host becomes a highly mobile transmission vector, actively seeking out new victims while remaining physically capable of pursuing and overwhelming them. As the infection progresses to stage 2, the hosts become stalkers. The fungus begins to physically alter their bodies, growing visible fungal plates and tendrils. Their behavior becomes more predatory and calculating. They've lost even more of their humanity, but gained enhanced sensory capabilities that make them more effective hunters. By stage 3, the clickers represent something truly alien. The fungus has completely consumed the host's face and head, replacing human sensory organs with fungal growth that provides echolocation abilities. These creatures are no longer recognizably human, yet they retain enough motor function to remain dangerous predators. The final stages push this transformation even further, with bloaters representing massive tank-like creatures whose bodies have become living spore factories, and the various other evolved forms that appear throughout the series. Each stage serves a specific purpose in the fungus's reproductive and transmission strategy. This systematic progression from human to something entirely other reflects a deep understanding of how real parasites manipulate their hosts. The most successful parasites don't just kill randomly. They modify host behavior in very specific ways that maximize their own reproductive success, often at the expense of everything that made the host what it originally was. But here's the million-dollar question that keeps mycologists and infectious disease experts awake at night. Could this actually happen? Is there anything preventing a real Cordyceps strain from making the evolutionary leap to human infection? The answer is more complicated and unsettling than you might expect. Human beings present both opportunities and challenges for a potential fungal parasite. On one hand, our complex brains and sophisticated immune systems create significant barriers to infection. Our body temperature alone is higher than most fungi can tolerate, which is why serious fungal infections in healthy humans are relatively rare. Our immune systems have evolved over millions of years to recognize and eliminate foreign biological threats, including fungal spores and hyphal growth. But on the other hand, humans offer something no other potential host can provide: global connectivity and massive population density. A fungus that successfully adapted to human infection wouldn't be limited to small forest ecosystems. It could potentially spread across continents within days, reaching population centers that could provide millions of new hosts. The real question isn't whether such an adaptation is possible. It's whether the evolutionary pressures exist that would drive such a dramatic host jump. And unfortunately, human activity might be creating exactly those pressures. Climate change is pushing ecosystems to their breaking points, forcing countless species into new territories and creating unprecedented contact between organisms that have never interacted before. Deforestation brings humans into direct contact with fungal spores that have remained isolated in remote forests for millennia. Our global food system, with its massive monocultures and industrial farming practices, creates perfect breeding grounds for fungal mutations and adaptations. Consider what happened with wheat rust, a fungal pathogen that has plagued agriculture for centuries. This fungus has repeatedly evolved new strains that can overcome plant resistance genes, sometimes wiping out entire crops across multiple continents. The speed at which these adaptations occur is genuinely frightening. We're talking about evolutionary changes that happen within growing seasons, not geological timescales. Now imagine that same adaptive pressure being applied to a Cordyceps strain that comes into repeated contact with human populations. Each exposure event represents a potential lottery ticket for the fungus. Most attempts at cross-species infection fail spectacularly, but evolution only needs to succeed once to change everything. What makes this scenario even more plausible is the existence of fungal infections that already affect human behavior, albeit in subtle ways. Toxoplasmosis, caused by the parasite Toxoplasma gondii, has been linked to changes in personality, risk-taking behavior, and even mental health conditions. While not a fungus, it proves that microscopic organisms can indeed influence human psychology and decision-making processes. Some researchers have identified correlations between certain fungal exposures and neurological symptoms. Chronic exposure to specific mold species has been associated with mood disorders, cognitive impairment, and behavioral changes. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, but the evidence suggests our brains are far more vulnerable to microbial influence than we'd like to admit. The terrifying reality is that our understanding of fungal biology is still remarkably limited. We've identified only a tiny fraction of the fungal species that exist on Earth. Many estimates suggest we've cataloged less than 5% of all fungi in existence. That means there are potentially millions of unknown fungal species out there, some of which might already possess capabilities we can't even imagine. Recent discoveries have shattered many of our assumptions about what fungi can and cannot do. Scientists have found fungi that can survive in space, tolerate extreme radiation, and adapt to environmental conditions that would kill virtually any other life form. Some species can remain dormant for decades before reactivating when conditions become favorable. Perhaps most unsettling of all, researchers have discovered that some fungi can actually communicate with each other through vast underground networks called mycorrhizal networks. These fungal internet systems span entire forests, allowing different fungal colonies to share resources and information across enormous distances. If a Cordyceps strain developed the ability to coordinate its infections through similar networks, the implications would be catastrophic. The infection mechanics presented in The Last of Us become even more chilling when you consider how fungi actually reproduce and spread in nature. Unlike viruses or bacteria, fungi can employ multiple transmission strategies simultaneously. They can release airborne spores, contaminate food and water sources, and even manipulate infected hosts to seek out optimal transmission environments. In the game, we see infected humans drawn to dark, humid spaces where fungal growth thrives. This behavior mirrors what scientists observe in real Cordyceps infections, where infected insects are compelled to find microenvironments that maximize spore production and dispersal. The fungus essentially transforms its host into a biological GPS system, guiding them to locations where the next generation of spores will have the best chance of survival and transmission. The spore release mechanisms shown in the game are particularly well researched. Real Cordyceps fungi have evolved incredibly sophisticated spore dispersal systems. Some species can actually aim their spores with remarkable precision, calculating wind patterns and environmental factors to maximize transmission range. Others create explosive spore releases that can contaminate areas far larger than you'd expect from such a small organism. What makes fungal infections especially dangerous compared to viral or bacterial pathogens is their persistence in the environment. Bacterial infections can often be controlled with antibiotics, and viral outbreaks eventually burn themselves out as populations develop immunity. But fungi are different. They can establish permanent reservoirs in the environment, continuing to produce infectious spores for years, or even decades after the initial outbreak. Fungal spores are incredibly resilient. They can survive extreme temperatures, drought conditions, and chemical treatments that would destroy most other pathogens. Some species produce spores that remain viable for centuries, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate and begin new infections. This means that even if an initial Cordyceps outbreak were contained, the environmental contamination could persist indefinitely, creating ongoing risks for future generations. The game's depiction of environmental contamination zones becomes particularly relevant when you understand how real fungi colonize and transform their surroundings. Fungi don't just infect individual hosts, they can completely alter entire ecosystems. They break down organic matter, change soil chemistry, and create conditions that favor their own reproduction, while making the environment hostile to competing organisms. In a real Cordyceps outbreak scenario, we wouldn't just be dealing with infected humans. The fungus would likely begin terraforming human environments, breaking down building materials, contaminating water supplies, and creating vast networks of fungal growth throughout urban areas. Cities could become uninhabitable, not just because of infected residents, but because the very infrastructure would be consumed and transformed by aggressive fungal colonization. The most disturbing aspect of this scenario is how it would challenge every assumption we have about controlling infectious disease outbreaks. Our entire pandemic response infrastructure is built around the idea that we're fighting pathogens that behave like viruses or bacteria. We have protocols for quarantine, contact tracing, and medical treatment that assume the pathogen follows predictable patterns of transmission and progression. But a Cordyceps-style infection would operate by completely different rules. Traditional quarantine measures might be useless if the fungus could spread through environmental contamination, rather than just human-to-human contact. Contact tracing would become meaningless if infected individuals were no longer capable of rational communication or cooperation with health authorities. Even our medical infrastructure would face unprecedented challenges. How do you treat a patient whose brain has been hijacked by a fungus? How do you maintain hospital safety when infected individuals might become violently aggressive and pose physical threats to healthcare workers? How do you develop treatments for an organism that's actively rewriting its host's biology in real time? These questions highlight the fundamental difference between the Last of Us infection and the pandemic scenarios we're more familiar with. This wouldn't just be a public health crisis. It would be an existential threat to human civilization itself. The infected wouldn't be patients seeking treatment. They would be active agents working against their own species' survival, driven by biological imperatives that serve the fungus rather than human welfare. The speed of progression shown in the game also reflects real-world fungal capabilities. Some Cordyceps species can complete their entire infection cycle within days or even hours. Unlike viral infections that might take weeks to fully develop, or bacterial infections that can be caught and treated if diagnosed early. A rapidly progressing fungal infection could transform victims before anyone realized what was happening. This rapid progression would make containment virtually impossible using conventional methods. By the time health authorities recognized they were dealing with a new type of pathogen, infected individuals could already be in advanced stages of behavioral modification, actively working to spread the infection further rather than seeking medical help. The game's global collapse scenario becomes frighteningly plausible when you consider how interconnected our modern world has become. A single infected individual boarding an international flight could potentially seed outbreaks on multiple continents before anyone realized what was happening. Our global transportation networks, designed to move people and goods efficiently around the world, would become the perfect distribution system for a fungal pathogen with pandemic potential. So where does this leave us? After diving deep into the science behind both real Cordyceps infections and the fictional scenario presented in The Last of Us, the answer to our original question becomes unsettlingly clear. Could this actually happen? The honest truth is that while a direct jump from insect-targeting Cordyceps to human-infecting variants remains highly unlikely, it's not scientifically impossible. The barriers are significant. Human immune systems, body temperature, and brain complexity all present major obstacles that would require extraordinary evolutionary leaps to overcome. But nature has surprised us before, and the increasing environmental pressures we're creating through climate change, deforestation, and global connectivity are exactly the kinds of conditions that could accelerate such adaptations. What makes this scenario particularly chilling is that we wouldn't see it coming. The first cases would likely be misdiagnosed as mental health crises or viral infections. By the time we understood what we were dealing with, containment might already be impossible. Unlike the zombie outbreaks in traditional horror fiction, a real Cordyceps pandemic would be driven by actual biological mechanisms that we're only beginning to understand. The fungal kingdom represents one of the greatest unknowns in biology. With millions of species yet to be discovered and fundamental gaps in our understanding of how they interact with complex nervous systems, we're essentially flying blind into a future where fungal threats could emerge from anywhere. Perhaps the most sobering realization is that our current medical and emergency response systems are completely unprepared for this type of biological threat. We've built our defenses around familiar enemies, but fungi operate by entirely different rules. They're patient, persistent, and capable of strategies that would make traditional pathogens seem simple by comparison. Does this mean you should start stockpiling supplies and planning for the fungal apocalypse? Probably not. The likelihood of such an event remains low, and there are far more immediate threats to worry about. But it does mean we should take fungal research more seriously, invest in understanding these remarkable organisms, and perhaps show a bit more respect for the microscopic world that surrounds us every day. The next time you're walking through a forest and see mushrooms growing from a fallen log, remember that you're witnessing one of nature's most sophisticated biological systems in action. And maybe, just maybe, keep in mind that the line between science fiction and scientific possibility isn't always as clear as we'd like to believe. After all, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that could actually exist.